Welcome everybody to this week's drop-in session. So the topic today we're exploring is Skore for business analysis. So just like a lot of these sessions, we'll just sort of talk a little bit about the topic or the title of the session. What I'm going to do today is just kind of present a couple of the more common business analysis tools that you may or may not be familiar with. Obviously, there's a huge number of business analysis tools out there available, different methodologies and so on, but I'm just going to sort of pick some of the most common ones. And then again, as we commonly do with this, we'll then dive into Skore and talk about how you can actually apply some of those. So given that there's so many, what I'm going to do is just kind of pick a couple of the more common ones, or certainly the more common ones that we've seen or used over the years. There's a lot of sort of similarities between kind of how the different tools work. So I'm just going to pick a couple to sort of show you, and then I'm going to use one example to just do a little bit of configuration. So if you haven't used any of these types of tools within Skore in the past, give you a little bit of an insight into how you might be able to configure the system to do it. And then we'll also look at some of the different reports or analysis that are built into Skore as well off the back of it. First question is, what is business analysis? So what I've actually done here is I just went and took the International Institute for Business Analysis definition from their website, but it talks about business analysis is the practice of enabling change in an organizational context by defining needs and recommending solutions that deliver value to stakeholders. But even that's a massively broad piece of description of what it is. But I then myself sat down and thought about, okay, what is the role of the business analysis actually involved? And they're great. I love some of your comments there, because you talked about the communication, you talked about the translator, and I sort of came up with this idea of the business analyst is a bit like being a detective, a translator. You've got to be an engineer and an architect. You've got to be a communicator. You're facilitating conversations. I put designer in there, just like engineer. It's, sometimes you're facilitating a solution or trying to help understand a solution or bringing ideas and thoughts. I mean, these again can be very, very broad, but there's a lot that we often ask of business analysts. But essentially, it's that what we're trying to do, as the sentence at the top says, it's about enabling change or successful change within an organization. Again, it's about researching, understanding, exploring within the organization, collaborating, working with different people to understand problems, help people articulate problems, turn those into solutions and opportunities for the organization. So what I'll do now is I'm just going to flash up some of the sort of common tools. Now, this is in no way an exhaustive list of tools, so these are just some very, very common ones. But I've got a business analyst book in the office, and I think it has 79 different business analysis tools in it, and even that is not exhaustive. But the first one I've got here is obviously process mapping, because Skore is a process documentation tool. So it's the core of what we do in here is process mapping. Now, I'm not saying that a business analyst will always use process mapping for the work they do, but it is a key tool within the business analyst toolbox, because what it does is it helps us to understand how work and information flow through the organization and how that value gets delivered to customers. And we might be talking about internal processes, or we could be talking about customer journeys, so looking at from the outside in. But again, they are processes that we're trying to understand how they flow. So while it's not the only, or it may not be the main tool of a business analyst, it is really, really important, because lots of these other things that I've got listed here can then hang off the back of your processes. So often documenting the process is the first step to then performing that research and analysis into into other aspects of the organization. So we've got here activity-based costing. So if we were doing some sort of analysis to understand where are we losing money or time within the organization, or Perhaps we're looking at it a slightly different way. Maybe we're looking to build a business case for some sort of change. So understanding how long a process takes and how much it costs a day, so that we can then assess that against what we want to change in the future. Again, is a common sort of thing we see. Another one here, I've got requirements gathering. So typically, associated with systems change and implementation, but not always. Often we're looking at business requirements just for an organizational change. So it might not necessarily involve systems or automation, although that's where we most commonly see it. But again, this can be done outside of the process, but if we've got the process as the backdrop for how we're delivering value to customers, then we can use that to hang as a framework to hang off and start to understand the different requirements that are required. I've called this requirements gathering and analysis in one here. So obviously the gathering is the elicitation of the requirements. So processes are really good, because when you do process mapping exercises, people often describe what they need while they're describing what they do. So that's a great way of helping you to sort of facilitate the gathering of the. And then when we talk about analysis, here what I'm really talking about is the sort of prioritization of those requirements. So really starting, you ask someone what they want and they'll give you a big long list of things. But then you need to go, okay, well, we can't deliver everything. So what's the high priority? What would come next? And then if we've got time at the end, what are the other things that we might do? So there's various tools or sort of flavors of that, if you like. The one I'm going to show you in a second is the Moscow one, where we try to assess requirements in terms of whether it's a must-have, a should-have, could-have, or actually something we definitely don't want. Another common tool, which is often used outside of process but does work well with inside processes as well, as a SWOT analysis, where we're looking for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. So again, you could easily do that at a departmental, divisional, business unit, or even full organizational level. You could do it on a product level. But equally, it will work on a process level. And one of the nice things, a bit like with the requirements gathering, is if you're looking at it, if you've mapped a process, you can then go step by step through the process and start to look at individual steps. And so do we recognize, or can we identify any strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats? And again, what I'm going to do in the example, which I'll show you in a second, is actually show you how to create a little SWOT analysis within Skore, and then how you could then roll that up to do it for a whole process. Another very common one we see in Skore, obviously, that a lot of users build into their processes, is roles and responsibility analysis. Likewise, we often see that more commonly done in a different way. So we often see it done where the roles are defined first, and then we try to work out what the responsibilities are. The Skore approach is very much, again, we start with the process and then we go individually through the process, and we can apply responsibilities based on the roles we've assigned to individual activities in the process. And Skore supports things like RACI or RACI, if you call it that way, or rapid, or all of the different variations you can configure the system to do that sort of analysis too. That, again, really interesting, can be really useful for organizational design and also hiring, because you can go through individual steps and apply the responsibilities. You can then run reports by role. It'll then start to tell you what are the different responsibilities of individual roles. Another common one, looking at process improvement, you might look at a process and go, okay, what are things that we want to stop doing? What are things that we should start doing? And what are things that we should do better? So I've used this extensively in the past, but I call it stop, start, accelerate. And there again, there's different versions of that. Another common one, risk analysis, looking at a process individually, step by step, and trying to understand what the different risks might be to that. Now, one of the things that's really common to all of these, except perhaps the activity-based costing one in this example, is that these are all based on sort of categorization of items. Yeah, so whether it's the requirements gathering, applying Moscow, whether it's SWOT, applying strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, start, stop, accelerate, or even within risk, we might be looking at different levels like high, medium, and low impact, that sort of thing. They're all categorization based assessments where you look through the process. And again, Skore's really good at being able to build that type of analysis in, so you can build a form, you can apply it to your process, and then pull out various reporting analysis. So that's what I'm going to go through in a second. What I will quickly do is I'm just going to touch on the activity or the costing piece. Now, again, we've done whole drop-ins just on the costing piece, so I'm not going to go into any detail on it. But just if there's anyone on the session today that hasn't seen it previously, I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of that. Then what I'll do is show you an example of the Moscow with requirements gathering, and then I'll show you how to build one of these using SWOT, and then I think we'll be out of time at that point. So let's go look at a sort of costing example here. So I've got a process open now. I've got a very simple process that I've got for this. You could make these much more complex if you needed to. And in fact, Skore even allows you to aggregate multiple processes. So if you've applied costing to several processes at once and you wanted to roll those up into a single analysis, it would allow you to do that too. But for the purposes of this, I wanted to keep something very simple. So what I've got here is essentially a processing invoices process. So we've got invoices coming in from suppliers. We're going to import them into our accounting system. That invoice is then going to be paid against a purchase order in the system, at which point there's a business rule. So any invoices that are under 10,000 British pounds in this case would go through to finance admin for approval. Any invoices that are over 10,000 British pounds, in this case, what happens is the finance admin actually forwards that onto a finance manager to approve it. So we've got two different levels of approval in this case. You'll see that two of these boxes have got detailed views. So this just to sort of show you what happens with costs when we've got detailed views. What we do is actually in the detail level is where we'd apply the time and cost information. And to show you how that works, you'll see each of the boxes here as a paperclip icon, a little attachment. And if I open that up on the attachment panel, you will see there's an extra form there called quantify. And if I open that up, it's in here that we apply the timing information. And essentially what we do is you look at the process step by step and you say, how long does that activity take? How long does the next activity take? So our first one here, review email, takes 5 minutes. If we go and look at enter invoice details into accounting system, that's typically taking 5 minutes. And then uploading the copy of the electronic invoice, we've got 1 minute there. Again, there's some other information in there, but I'm not going to go into that detail, but just to sort of give you the basics. So essentially what we can do is go step by step through the process and apply duration information to that. The other thing we can do in Skore is with the individual roles that are against each step, we can also apply an hourly cost to it. And what we can then do is we can use that information to then start to understand how long the process takes and then what it costs. So just like a lot of the tools that I'm going to show you today, they're found under the business tools section on the bottom left-hand side there. And if I open that up, you've got the various tools available. I'm looking at quantify. So if I open up quantify there, it opens with a summary piece of information. So it's telling me how many processes, how many boxes, number of roles, and then it's given me a summary of the cost and processing time. Now over here on the left, I've got various tools. I'm just going to look at duration and costs today. If I go and hit duration, what it's doing now is it's currently looking at a single iteration of the process. It tells me the total lead time, so the total time this process takes. It shows me the processing time, so this is the time that people are actually spent working on the process, and then the waiting time is all the time where we're waiting for something else to happen. So in this case, most commonly it's going to be things like approval steps. And if I scroll down to the charts that fall below, you'll see a combination chart where it's showing the actual activity or processing time versus the waiting time, and you can see the two approval steps are the two that have the most delay within them. Again, this analysis allows us to break down by roles as well as by individual activities in the process. It helps you to start to understand where bottlenecks might be. So is it based on individual steps within the process? Sometimes it's related more roles within the system as well. So often if you've got, if you don't have enough roles to do the work, that often leads to a delay in the process, and that can be highlighted here. And we do a very similar thing to costs. So it then works out the individual cost of every activity. It'll also work out the costs of the roles in there. Okay, so as I said, I'm not going to go into any more detail on the costing piece, but just so that if you're not familiar with it already, to know that that type of analysis is in there. So the second piece that I wanted to quickly show you through is the example of the requirements and the Moscow approach. So here I've got a different process here, a procure to pay process. And if I click through, I'm not sure if I've got any on these. I think these are most, yeah, okay, I do have one on this one. So if I click through, so I've just clicked on one of the attachments here. You can see here we've got requirements captured. The tool we're using is the custom field tool. And if I go into edit mode, I will show you how that works. So what happens here is that often when you're documenting or mapping the process, you're also talking about what are the requirements, what are the things you need for individual steps within the process. So as those requirements or those discussions come, you can attach them to those specific points in the process. And that's exactly what happened here. So where we've got send requisition to buyer's manager is the activity. We've got a couple of requirements here. So we've got notify certain users when a new requisition requires approval. And we've got another one, which is the ability for certain users to manually approve requisitions. So these are very vague requirements. So you could add something much more detailed if you needed to. But you can see that they've now also been tagged with whether they're a must-have or a should-have requirement. And typically what happens when you're doing this in a real life workshop exercise, you often don't have the time to do that additional level of categorization. Sometimes it does, but actually what happens more often than not is that most people will tell you all the requirements and must-haves. And then you do a sort of follow-up exercise to go, okay, we've got capacity to do 20 must-have requirements, but you've said there are 30. So which are the 10 that you're going to change or change the priority on? So we use these custom fields. You'll see there's a button there that adds a custom field. If I click on that, in my list of custom fields I've got available, I've got one there called requirement. So I simply click that, it adds this little form on. So I can use the comment field to describe my requirement. And then I've got an optional grouping field. So again, often when you're gathering the requirements in the first instance, you don't necessarily need to fill in the grouping, but you could come back and do it later. But here you'll see if I click on this, I've got this little drop down. So, I can then define whether it's a must have, a should have, a could have, or I definitely don't want to have this non-requirement. I can tag that as. And so when I've done that, I can click confirm here, and that gets my new requirement, you see, gets saved against this particular step in the process. How I can start to get this information. So there's a couple of things I can do. If I go back to the business tools option, I can run a report on that. And so if I go to the report tool, just click through onto the report tool, you'll see all the different reports available, and then under custom fields there's a report there called requirement. And if I open this up, it includes an awful lot of information, but what it does do, if I just scroll over, you'll see it will give me the description of the requirement, the grouping, so whether it's a should have, could have, must have, and so on. And I can filter by these if I need to, but it also tells me what process that's associated with, which diagram that sits on, which activity that's on, and all of that information can be dropped out to an Excel if you want to do some further analysis outside of it. The other tool I wanted to show you, which is quite useful, as I said, which often happens when you do that first pass of requirements, and every requirement, or it feels like every requirement, is a must-have. Here, you also have this little analytics tool available to you. And if I click on there, so in a similar sort of way, it gives me a summary of different types of information that it pulls from the process. But here I've got my custom field, my requirement custom field. If I click on that, it gives me some analysis of it. And this, again, can be really useful when you're looking at it. So first of all, in my process, I've got both roles assigned to the activities and I've got systems. So initially it's showing me how many requirements have been gathered around different roles. And it also shows me requirements around different systems. So sometimes that gives you some insight. One of the things I've often seen with processes where we've done this is you clearly start to see requirements cluster around roles that are very manual, that are doing lots of manual activities. That can be quite interesting. The other one I quite like is this one here. So it gives you a grouping based on the accounts, based on the number of the requirements by the categories. And so here, most of them are must-haves, but we've got a couple of one should have, one could have, and one won't have. So again, a good way to sort of present that back to stakeholders sometimes when you know that there's a limited amount of capacity to do must-have requirements. You can have that sort of discussion going, actually, let's go through some of these again and check to see whether they really are must-have requirements. I would like to show you how we create something like this. So obviously we've got the requirement one already. I'd like to use the SWOT analysis as an example so you can see how you could create your own tool like this. I'm just going to pick any activity. Again, I'm going to click on the attachment panel and I'm going to go to the custom field. So when I click on custom field here, the list that it's showing me here is likely to be different to what you see because these are all ones that I've specifically defined before. But providing you're an editor within Skore, you should have the option to create a new custom field. And if I click on new custom field, I can give it a name. So here I'm just going to call it SWOT for my SWOT analysis. And then it allows me to predefine the grouping available for it. So if I click on grouping, I'm going to call this a strength. I'll add another one. So I click new grouping again. So we've got strength, weakness, a new grouping is opportunity. And then I'll do the last one, which is threat. So that's all I need to do. In fact, I could just get away with just giving it a name. The grouping is optional, but obviously I want to use it here because I want to do that analysis by the different categories. And then I click create there, and you'll see straight away that it's added my SWOT on there. So it's picked one of the groupings straight away for me, but I can easily change that. So it might be that I've identified a strength at a particular step in the process. So I could then describe the strength in the text field there, and I can click confirm to save that. I could go to another activity, and if I click on the attachments, again, I can get a custom field. Now that I've added that, when I look at my list, I now have my SWOT table is in there. So I can click that. Again, I can choose whatever, I've identified an opportunity. It is whatever it is. And I can go through the different steps in the process. Again, it might be that in not every step there is a strength, weakness, opportunity or threat that you identify, but the process acts as the framework to help you facilitate a discussion with colleagues and then describe those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities or threats as you go through it. I'm just going to do a little quick refresh here because sometimes when you've just created a new custom field and then add it to a process, it sometimes takes a couple of minutes before it shows up in the business tool. So I just did a quick refresh there. But again, I can roll this up now and I'll just go and do a quick reporting, and you'll see there in my custom fields reports, the SWOT analysis arrives and I can run the report and get that information straight away. Once again, thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.